Hi everyone, and welcome back to our cover crop study at Brassicas Services. I want to go through and take a look at some of the observations that we've got at this time of year. It is December 30th, so we've had a real wide range of weather that these plants have experienced. I'm pretty excited to see what they've done. And we've really all in all tried to approach this really scientifically. So we went into this when I planted them. I had a hypothesis on what things were going to do. And as we've gone through these steps, see how they progress. And hopefully I can learn a little bit and you guys as viewers can learn some too if you're looking at cover crops and looking at what species to put out in your field. First off, I wanted to speak to the growing season, some of the issues we had, some of the positives we had. We'll start with the cons or the negatives we've had. Two main big ones that I've seen and might change. The first off is just the methodology of the experiment. We've got these plants growing in more or less test tubes or long vases. The issue that I found with that is we aren't able to filter water out the bottom of the soil structure. So we get some ponding in here. I tried to be fairly diligent on spoon feeding water to them. You can go one step farther, and if you can kind of read between the lines, when I talk about spoon feeding water to that, I tried to keep all the products in as realistic of an environment as possible. So these plants have been out all year. I've kept them in a wagon in boxes, so the roots aren't exposed to sunlight, only the top canopy is. But that being said, not being able to filter that water out, I was having to more or less irrigate it myself. You know what that means, whether you're a corn, soybeans, wheat farmer, or even just somebody with your lawn. Just the huge difference that rainwater makes. What difference just tap water played? It was hard tap water, as close to irrigation water as we could get being applied to them, but obviously there's a difference. So whatever difference that made in terms of growth, it's probably not huge, but I'm sure there is a difference there. The second issue we ran into was actually pest pressure. We had some pest pressure out in our cornfield right across the road from where this experiment was happening, and that was the grasshoppers were working in grassy areas and moved into corn. Eventually some of them came over here, and we saw extensive clipping on a lot of this foliage. So we had two instances where all of these products were clipped completely to the soil level. And they came back. After the second time, I started applying insecticide to the top of them to try to mitigate that, and was pretty successful. I actually, in some of my observations at the end, I took pictures about a month and a half ago, and the spring oats here on the end was actually clipped all the way to the bottom. But pretty happy. We only had one species failure, and that was the barcant turnip that did not survive after its foliage was clipped off. Positives, we've had a really nice growing season for this. We've had a real wide spectrum of temperature, good moisture. All in all, where we were this summer, we had a little bit higher than average moisture. Obviously, if you go back to what I said prior, that probably wouldn't have been a huge issue, being how I was manually watering. But speaking to what we would see, pretty stereotypical or common, comparing this to what farmers would have planted after a wheat planting. So I want to go ahead and talk about some of these species that we've got here. We'll do some in-depth looks at this. Up close, looking at the top plant structure as well as the root structure. There's a lot of products I'm pretty excited to see here and talk with you about. Up here first, I've got all of our grasses in here. We've got annual rye, triticale, barley, cereal rye, and spring oats. If you notice down below here, I've marked the rooting depth of each of these species. So you can see the very farthest down that I was able to detect roots. You can also see how these roots have populated the soil structure. There is a fairly wide difference with what we see here one of the initial observations that I had, just based on seedling vigor and germination, was triticale was excellent. It came out of the ground the fastest by a day or two, and it had the initial bump there where it came out very fast. Now looking here late season, we can see that probably barley, annual rye, and cereal rye have a fairly extensive root mass compared to that. So if that's weighing in your decisions on what to pick, I would say that the annual rye has the most extensive rooting depth, as well as 14 inches. So it's farthest down there, and it is definitely the most robust root system here in the ground. It comes with its pros and cons, though. So I will go over that here in a minute when we dive into each of these species in depth. So let's change gears here a little bit. I'm going to swap these species out, and we'll take a look at some of our brassicas. So up now, we've got our brassica species. As I said before, the barcant turnip that should have been sitting here is gone. That one kind of fell victim to the grasshoppers. But over here, the first one we have is radish. We got trophy rape over here, and both of these are commonly used brassicas that we put in mixes as a soil loosener, as a compaction, something to mitigate compaction. You obviously, probably the most popular species out there is the tillage radish, which is what this is. There's been some speculation over the years that maybe it doesn't do as much as what we thought, compared to maybe a grass being able to punch down through the soil as well. And I would somewhat agree to that. After looking at what we've got here in the growth, I was actually quite excited to see the rooting depth. So let's go ahead and take a look at radish first. As we can see, radish is 16 inches. This was by far the farthest one in rooting depth, next to annual rye. And honestly, what we would generally see is after a wheat production, we would have an annual rye with a radish and possibly a legume to give us some nitrogen if we're going to follow that with corn. So with a mix like that, we're going to be really establishing a deep rooting structure, loosening that soil, possibly pulling some nutrients back up to the surface. What we also see here in this vase is when we think of a radish, typically we think of a large taproot going down. Now this taproot starts at the top, and it is about the size of a Crayola marker, maybe just a little bit smaller, so not very large, but we're still able to establish that very deep rooting depth. One of my hypotheses that I had when I started this was when we looked at this, we would see a massive taproot moving down this glass. For whatever reason, I believe that taproot is in there, but it's not growing against it. And what we see is a lot of the hair roots that a lot of the people that are familiar with the radish often see. So when we pull that radish out of the ground, we might look at it and say, well, gosh, it only went down there, 6, 8, 10, 12 inches. But it's a lot of these hair roots that are going down also that are getting some of that compaction broken up and pushing down the extra distance that might break off when we pull a radish. I would assume that this is going to keep pushing out of the ground a little bit. We generally see that from growers, depending on whether it hits a hard pan layer in the soil, it starts making that protrude somewhat out of the top, but it has extended itself a little bit. Also, I'd like to talk to the foliage here. We've got some frost damage. Like I said, it is December 30th, and I would have expected it to maybe be frost killed by now. We've had somewhat of a mild winter, so we haven't got a hard killing frost. And this product will winter kill after 3 consecutive nights in the teens. So we can get down to that 18, 20 degree mark on one night out of the week, and this will still survive. And that's what we've seen with this product. We've dipped down to those temperatures probably 3 times this growing season. It has nipped some of that foliage, but it is still continuing on. And I think we even would have the prospect, if we got 4 to 6 inches of snow over this, it would insulate this to where it might not even winter kill unless we get down to those very cold temperatures. So let's go ahead and move on to trophy rape next. Rapeseed is something that we have used in the past here at Brassicas Surfaces as a product that is a little more winter hardy than radish. It typically does not have a tap root. It puts on a more robust fibrous root system, and that is what we see here. My original expectations was that it would be down every bit as far, if not farther, than the taproot radish, and I'm really not seeing that. We've got a little bit stronger of a main root going down here, and then it busts out, probably 5 to 6 inches below the root or the soil surface, and gets that real fibrous system established down to about that 12-inch mark. But definitely a solid product. We can see that it has been affected less by the frost than the radish. And this is a species that we typically would possibly plant in a mix that's going to be seeded a little bit later than the radish. So that is our brassicas. So now I'm going to move on to our legume species and take a look at those. All right, next up, we've got our legumes. So legumes, I do have marked the rooting depth here, but it really isn't that super important when we talk about legumes, the rooting depth, just because we're really not trying to do much underground besides fix nitrogen and release that back to the upcoming crop. That being said, one thing that I was really surprised and excited about during this experiment was with the product, the Austrian winter peas. This had some good growth early on. It's been affected a little bit by the frost here as of late, but out of all of the products, it had a very robust rooting depth, to the point that I almost feel like I could go out and say that this is a product that could possibly be a soil loosener, mitigate some compaction. It's not as robust of a root system, but it definitely punches down. And we see here, it's in that 14 to 15 inch range. One thing I also will say, as I was watering these or irrigating these products, you can see, if you looked in close, we do have a fair amount more of water in each of these vases as compared to the grasses, which should be expected. Obviously, we look at things like red clover, crimson clover, not a lot of vegetative growth there. So the factories just aren't really pumping that water up yet. Finally, here on the end, we have hairy vetch. That is put on the highest root growth, or excuse me, not root growth, but top growth, which is stereotypically what I have seen in the past. That is our legumes. Obviously, all these are capable of putting down large amounts of nitrogen through their root structure and putting on nodules within that. Two things I want to say that as we've gone through this process, as we've worked with cover crops, is playing with legumes in and of itself can be somewhat of a dicey game, and I want to caution growers on when they plant these and some of the claims out there. So whether you're talking about red clover, hairy vetch, Austrian peas, I've heard things from 180 to 300 pounds of nitrogen that these will fix. Nitrogen in and of itself is hard to calculate how much is going to be there that time of day and available to the crop. So I caution growers against planting these, and well, the book said I could get 300 pounds, so I'm going to roll out of my nitrogen program by half. I wouldn't do that. We can supplement our nitrogen program with these products. There's going to be some benefits there, but the real thing that we're going to get out of this, or the hurdle we have to get over, is when is that relay going to happen? When is this product going to hand that nitrogen off to our next crop? So that's something that I think cover crop enthusiasts in general are learning more about. We know that it does have large amounts of nitrogen, but how do we get that corn to take that up before the nitrates that are being released from this could possibly be leached? So we're going to continue to grow with that. Look ahead in maybe some future videos as we do some more work on that. The second thing I do want to speak about on these legumes is just the plantability aspect of it. Obviously, when we talk about planting green in any of these products, whether it's a grass or the brassicas, the radish is going to rot down rather quickly. Oats are going to rot down quickly. We're not going to have as much issue with that in the winter killing varieties. Rapeseed, it can get a little bit taller. I've seen it upwards of 5 feet. So keep that in mind when we're talking about planters and trash wheels. The other one I do want to speak to is the legume varieties. I don't think we're going to have as much issue with the red clover or crimson clover. Those are relatively small plants. Crimson does get a little bit higher than red, but mostly speaking about hairy vetch and Austrian peas. Let's start with the peas. Peas are going to be a somewhat lower plant. We're not going to get a lot of vegetative growth, more or less a smaller, bushier plant there close to the ground. The one that probably concerns me a little bit more would be hairy vetch. I have seen that as it continues to grow in the early spring. I've even let some of it go into the summer. We get a tall plant. We're talking probably 24 inches off the ground. And not so much the height is an issue, but the vines are quite problematic. I've heard of guys having issues with that species with trash wheels. It's essentially like running over a tiny extension cord. So it's going to get wrapped up. It's going to cause you issues. And for the most part, really, guys, at least my growers around here don't plant a lot of it. Just due to some of the negatives that we see with that. But that is speaking to those varieties, some of the things we might want to watch out as growers. But let's go ahead. Now that we've taken a look at these, kind of a 1,000-foot view, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these species and some of the observations that I've made since seeding.
So let's jump in and take an up-close look at the species that we just talked about. And I will give you some of my pros, cons, and observations that I saw throughout the growing season. First, let's take a look at annual ryegrass. This plant was unimpressive for most of the season, but as of late has shown its strength with both rooting depth and above ground biomass. I would rank this the #1 grass for achieving the goal of subsoil penetration just below the tillage radish. Although this is my favorite grass, it does have some limitations, which include the need to be seeded slightly earlier than the other grass varieties, as well as being more difficult to kill in the spring once reaching its rapid growth stage. Barley, my next selection, was a real toss-up for the top spot and may just be a top pick if you are a grower that will be seeding later in the season. This seed will have a shorter window of dormancy than annual ryegrass. Earlier in the season, this plant emerged well and took off in both foliar top growth and root structure. Typically, growers will use this grass to penetrate deep into the soil or as an erosion preventer. And this plant definitely fits the bill and will allow for greater water and root penetration of the following crop. Third is cereal rye. This species has the ability to be seeded late like the previous seed and showed excellent growth both above and below ground. Above ground, we see a somewhat narrow leaf pushing 8 inches tall. Below ground is what I really like about cereal rye, and that is its numerous consistent roots protruding down with root hairs extending laterally through the soil profile. While these roots may not go down as deep as barley or ryegrass, they are very numerous in the area which they populate. Next up is triticale. Triticale was the fastest emerging seed that rocketed out of the ground. It has comparable top growth to barley. I believe some of its vigor is derived from its origin as a cross between cereal rye and wheat. If we look at the rooting structure, we can see that it is comparable to the other grasses, although late season, to my surprise, it did fall behind some of the others. Additionally, this species is slightly more expensive than barley, and for those reasons, I would rank them in 4th place amongst the grasses. The last grass species is spring oats. Spring oats had an initial top growth comparable to the other 3 grasses, in the 4 to 5 inch range. As we look at the root structure, note its triangular rooting shape with decent soil depth. The final reason I place spring oats last in the grasses is the fact that it does not overwinter. On the flip side, this could make spring oats the best option for a grower not wanting to terminate a seeding prior to spring planting. For me, and this is my personal opinion, For an application post-wheat harvest or early soybean harvest, this seed can work or be a viable option as a companion seed with another overwintering species. For later seedings after corn or mid to late maturing beans, in our northern climate, I think there is more value and benefit to soils in an overwintering variety that has the opportunity to gain deeper root growth in the spring prior to termination. The most recognized cover crop, tillage radish, is next. This is another species that will winter kill, typically after a few nights in the teens. Much like spring oats, which is typically blended with radish, this can be a positive or a negative depending on the operation and what objectives they're after. Emergence of the tillage radish was excellent, and it hasn't slowed down all season. During an early fall observation, roots had reached down around 10 inches and now are at the 16-inch mark. This was my top performer in terms of rooting depth. Another brassica is next with trophy rapeseed. Trophy rape is a very small seeded species that can winter kill with very low temps. This seed is typically an alternative to the tillage radish and will have much taller stems with yellow flowers. Here we see a purple stem protruding from the soil with two lobe leaves. Below ground, initial observations showed a root system pushing down roughly 8 inches and starting to be more fibrous in nature. Here we can see the root system has continued with this fibrous structure that is generally shallower than the radish. Moving on, the next plant is Austrian winter peas. During this process, winter peas have been the most interesting to watch and learn about. Winter peas have a vine-like appearance with oval leaves above ground, but the most surprising characteristic about them is the massive root structure it is putting down early in the season. Not only are we getting soil penetration, but these roots will be the site of root nodulation or the result of nitrogen fixation from the atmosphere. Hairy vetch is next. The relatively slow emerging legume has a fine stem with narrow, oval-shaped leaves. This species, because it is a legume, will also fix nitrogen, like the Austrian winter peas, and is rated as a winter-hardy variety that is capable of producing massive amounts of N. Below ground, we can see a linear movement of the roots down nearly 12 inches for an impressive rooting depth. One downfall of hairy vetch growers should be aware of is that it is a hard-seeded variety, which could lead to germination in a future year that could make it a pest in crops such as wheat. Crimson clover, a well-known and used legume, is next. Crimson initially showed relatively slow emergence and has above-ground growth somewhat like an emerging soybean. Below ground, there is a single shoot moving down roughly 6 inches deep. One of our final seeds is red clover. Red clover is a very small seeded legume or nitrogen fixer that is a good option for aerial application or frost seeding. This species had relatively slow emergence, limited above ground growth, and as we move below soil, we can see a single shoot, much like crimson clover, beginning to move down through the soil profile. So that concludes this portion of our cover crop demonstration. I will have final observations out sometime in the spring to show how these plants overwintered, began to regrow, the final biomass, and the rooting depth. I hope everyone learned something new about the various species of cover crops in their initial growth and will help you to make informed decisions about cover cropping. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the spring.